Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about A Christmas Carol. So we are now starting on Stave 2, Chapter 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavouring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighbouring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. Okay, so as it says, it was very dark. He woke up, it was very dark. Distinguish means to be able to see clearly, to work out, to make out. Transparent means see through. Obviously, windows are see through. Opaque means the opposite, you can't see through. So obviously, walls are opaque, and this means room. So he was trying to pierce means to cut through or to see through the darkness with his ferret eye. So ferret is a small animal, a bit like a big rat or something. When the chimes means the sound that bells make from the church, strike the 4 quarters. So in other words, it rang 4 times. So he's thinking, I mean, different churches, different clocks work differently, but he's thinking that, oh, it must be quarter to something. So he listens for the next ring to see what time it is, what hour it is. So this whole ringing business is actually a bit confusing here, but you don't need to worry too much about it. What's important is what's going to come up in a minute, which I'm going to explain. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12? It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. 12. So because the clock has rung 12 times, it must mean that it's 12 o'clock. But he's really confused because he went to bed after 2 o'clock. So if it's 12 o'clock, either time has gone backwards to 12 o'clock at midnight, or he slept through the whole day onto next day, 12 o'clock at midday, which is something that somebody like Scrooge, you can imagine, would never do. So he's thinking the clock is wrong, and an icicle, which means a piece of ice, has got into the mechanism and broken the clock. Okay. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. So a repeater is a kind of clock back in the day. I don't know whether you can still get them nowadays, but where you can press a button, and it tells you the time by sound. In other words, it rings out just like a church bell. So preposterous means ridiculous. So he's talking about the church clock. Okay. But his repeater, his clock, confirms that the church clock was correct. Why, it is impossible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. So he's really confused now. The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Okay, so he's so alarmed, he's so confused about the time. He jumps out of bed, gropes his way to the window, he rubs off the frost, and even so, he can't really see anything. But what he can see is that it's still very foggy and very cold, but there's nobody running around making a noise to and from, okay, as there would have been if it was the next day. These lines are a bit confusing. Sorry. Yeah, this sentence here is confusing, but you don't need to worry too much about it. I will explain it just in case you are interested. So, Dickens obviously refers to events happening in the world at the time he was writing, which is fair enough. But obviously, because we're reading it almost 200 years later, unless you're an expert in history or a history teacher, and even then, history is almost infinite. You don't know, you wouldn't know everything. But remember that the United States was a new country then. It was only about 67 years old. Okay. So United States became independent in 1776. This book is being written in 1843. So it's only about 67, 70 years old. And so it was going, the banking system and the whole system was still being set up. So any kind of security, any kind of check from the United States wasn't totally reliable. Obviously, that's totally changed now. Nowadays, United States is like the most reliable country, generally speaking. And this thing about 3 days and so on. So normally you'd have like 3 days to pay. Okay. So don't worry about that. I've just told you what I've told you, just in case you're interested. So basically, just saying that if he can't tell the time or what day it is or how many days have passed, then he can't rely on anything. Scrooge went to bed again and thought and thought and thought it over and over and over and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Okay, so he's trying to puzzle it out, work it out. Perplexed means really confused and puzzled. Endeavor means to try. So no matter how much he thinks, he can't work this out. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? So this is fairly straightforward. He's obviously really bothered about the ghost. He keeps trying to work it out, whether it's a dream or not. But no matter how often he tries, no matter how often he thinks he's kind of solved the problem, he goes back and thinks again, was it a dream? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. Okay, so what he does is he kind of stays awake and until he stays awake for like 45 minutes, 3/4 of an hour, and then suddenly he remembers that the ghost said that the first spirit would visit him at 1 o'clock, right? So he thinks, okay, I might as well stay awake until then, and that basically he's so wide awake now, the chances of him going to sleep are about the same as going to heaven. He thinks this is the best thing to do. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. So obviously when you're lying awake, time goes very slowly. And for him it goes so slowly that he thinks, oh, he must have gone off to sleep and woken again and he's missed the time. But anyway, then it rings. Ding dong, 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong, 1/2 past. Ding dong, 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong, the hour itself, said Scrooge, and nothing else. But he spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did, with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. So you know how when you're waiting for something, even a second can seem like a long time. So he thinks the clock isn't going to ring, but actually it does. It means that it's 1 o'clock. Melancholy means sad, but obviously just a bit of personification going on here from Dickens. And when it strikes one, there's a big light in the room and the curtains of the bed. So his bed, some beds, sometimes back in the day, maybe they would have curtains around the bed itself. So he's obviously got those. So the curtains around his bed are drawn, are pulled aside. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. Okay, so Dickens uses a lot of repetition, especially in this story, because it's a ghost story, supernatural, and obviously you're going to doubt these things. I mean, at that time, people did sort of believe in ghosts, but even so, not totally. Otherwise, why would Scrooge be so doubtful? Anyway, so it just talks about the curtains being drawn. Recumbent means lying down, but here he's half lying, half sitting up now because of what's happening around him. And the unearthly visitor, so obviously, this is the first of the three spirits come to visit him, and it's the spirit that has pulled aside the curtains. And this line here is a bit confusing, as just simply means so. This is the narrator talking to the writer, the narrator talking to the reader. Okay, so different writers have different styles. So Dickens here is sort of talking to the reader and saying that metaphorically, I'm standing next to you because obviously when we read, we can hear the writer's voice in our heads, can't we? So metaphorically, they're kind of standing right next to us. It was a strange figure like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Okay, so a long paragraph here. So basically, it's a description of the first spirit. So let's go through it in detail. So it looks like a child, but also like an old man. So you know how sometimes babies can look like old men, can't they? It's a bit funny sometimes. And this here, so supernatural medium. So medium is like a material. So it's saying that it's as though if you were looking through some kind of a material, which made it look like. So recede means to go far. So it's as though the spirit has gone far, and therefore it looks like a child. It looks smaller, but it's actually an old man. But we don't know what it is. It's a child, but it looks old, and its hair is white. So again, in that case, it would be like an old man, but there's no wrinkles, so it looks like a child. So it's basically we don't know whether it's a child or an old man, and its skin is like a child. The arms are long and muscular, the hands the same and strong. So in that sense, it's a young person. The legs and feet are delicate, so that's young, and they're bare, so not wearing anything there. But so it's wearing a tunic. So a tunic is like a long shirt, sleeveless. So it's a bit like what they used to wear in ancient Rome, and that's also white. So you can the main impression here is of like whiteness, and it wears a belt. So lustrous means shining, and sheen also means shining. So it's a beautiful kind of shining belt, and it's holding a piece of holly in his hand, which is appropriate because it's Christmas. But then, in contradiction to that, so wintry emblem means like a badge or a sign or something. Its dress was trimmed. In this case, trimmed doesn't mean cut, but it means decorated with summer flowers. So it's this whole spirit is one of contradiction. Is it a child? Is it an old man? Is it winter? Is it summer? And then from the top of its head, crown of its head, there's a bright, clear jet of light. Now, it's not very clear what the light is. The way it's described is almost like electrical light, but there was no electricity back in those days. It's almost like a fire, but it doesn't really say fire, although it talks about a great extinguisher for a cap. So we don't really know what this is, but it's basically just so it's a cap, and presumably when the spirit wants there to be light, it takes the extinguisher off. So the word extinguisher implies that maybe this is fire, but it's kind of like a supernatural fire because obviously it's not burning the spirit. Mind you, the spirit is supernatural anyway. And if it wants darkness, then it would put the extinguisher back onto the fire. Quite complex. Don't need to worry too much about it. Dickens just creating like a detailed kind of picture, detailed story, and a detailed description of what this supernatural, strange, unusual first spirit looks like. And it's holding now the extinguisher under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality, for as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light in one instant, at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts, no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. So the next paragraph is quite confusing as well. So let's go through it in detail. So he's saying that even this, now, whether that's just referring to the extinguisher or the whole description here, not quite clear, but doesn't really matter. He's saying even all of this was not its strangest quality. What also was happening was that the belt was sparkling and glittering, but it was changing. So the bits of the belt were sometimes light, sometimes dark. And then, in addition to that, even more strange, the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness. So fluctuate means to change, to go up and down. So the figure itself kept changing. So 1 minute it only had one arm, then it only had one leg, then it had 20 legs, now two legs without a head, now a head without a body. And these bits of the body that were kind of dissolving means melting. And when they did, you wouldn't be able to see them, okay, as they melted away. And and then even as he kind of wondered at this, the whole thing would be there again, clear as ever. Okay. So again, you don't need to worry too much about understanding this whole paragraph. The point is that it's a very, very strange spirit. And it's supernatural, so obviously it would be strange. Just the simple fact that it's there is strange enough, right? Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me? Asked Scrooge. So foretold means to predict. I am. The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. Actually, reading this description, I should have said, I am, as though it was far away. Who and what are you? Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of his dwarfish stature. So this may be a reference to the fact that it looks like it's far away. No, your past. So the ghost is saying is that it's from Scrooge's past, that it knows about his childhood and so on. And in fact, this ghost is going to show Scrooge's past to him or remind him. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered. So he wants the spirit to cover the light. So in a way, because the light is so bright, he can't see the spirit. So he's thinking maybe if he covers the light, he might be able to see the spirit more clearly. So he begs the spirit to cover the light on his head. What? Exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? So the ghost says, what? You want me to put the light out? Now, this line here is confusing. It will become more clear as we read to the end of this stave, but maybe what he's implying is that the light represents Scrooge's emotions, and the cat represents the fact that he has repressed his emotions over the years. Okay, so that's possibly the meaning of this sentence here. Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. So, reverent means with respect, usually with connotations of like holiness and religion. Disclaim means to deny. So he says that he doesn't want to offend and that he has no knowledge of deliberately, willfully means deliberately, bonneted or cap. So bonnet is like a hat or cap. So like this cap here. And so he denies having deliberately capped his spirit at any period of his life. Okay. And then he asks the spirit why he's here. What business is he there for? And the ghost says, your welfare. I've come here for your welfare. That's my business. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately. So Scrooge says, thank you, but then can't help thinking that if he had been allowed to sleep, then his welfare would have been more likely. So conducive is something that makes an outcome more likely. Obviously, this is a bit of humor from Dickens. And the spirit must have heard him thinking, or possibly reads his mind, said immediately, your reclamation then, take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. So reclamation means to recover. So obviously, in this case, it's metaphorical. We're talking about reclaiming Scrooge's soul. Okay, this means pay attention because so obviously it's not very impressed with Scrooge's sense of humor here. So it puts out its hand and says, "Come with me and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. So here he's saying he can feel that there's no point trying to say, oh, please, it's cold, it's late, to go for a walk. So pedestrian means walking, right? Or that the bed is warm and that the outside is freezing, that he's only dressed, so clad means dressed, he's only dressed in his slippers, his dressing gown and nightcap, and that he's got a cold. So remember, he's not feeling well at the moment because the grasp, though quite gentle, basically he couldn't resist it. So he rose, he stands up, but as the spirit goes towards the window, he kind of holds his robe, his dressing gown, and begs. He says to the spirit, I am a mortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall. So he's saying, I'm a human being, I can be killed, I can die, and if I fall through the window, I will die. So to remonstrate means to argue with somebody, or to protest. Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. Now, these lines are a bit confusing, but basically he touches his heart and says, in a way, have faith. So I hold his hand physically, but also more importantly, trust him and he won't fall. Okay? As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. And as soon as he said that, they passed through the wall supernaturally. They find themselves on a country road with fields on either side. The city has vanished. Vestige means tiny bit, so not a tiny bit of the city can be seen. The darkness and mist has vanished as well, and it's a clear, cold winter day with snow on the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. So obviously that's fairly straightforward. He recognizes the place. It's where he grew up. Okay. So we're going to stop this video there and we're going to carry on with Stave 2 in the next video. So all that remains is to say, as always, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe and tell all your friends. And I'll see you in the next video where we'll carry on with Stave 2.